Pressure continues to grow on the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu after Hamas released a propaganda video of one of the 6 Israeli hostages whose bodies were found at the weekend. Now, Israeli military says it has killed a Hamas militant who appeared in a widely viewed video from October the 7th. Well, to discuss this in more detail and the situation in Israel, we're joined by the former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, Avi Meir. Sir, thank you so much for joining us here on Sky News. So lots of developments, but mainly we are now 48 hours into what has been the biggest protest that we've seen in Israel against Benjamin Netanyahu. We saw him come out quite defiantly last night. I'm wondering how long you think he can continue to ignore the protesters for.
Well, Barbara, the Prime Minister has resisted this kind of pressure in the past. We know, for example, that 1 year ago, as Israel was being wrought by these protests over the government's judicial reform, it appeared as though he was going to be forced to step down. But of course, he resisted pressure at that time. It's important to realize that this country is torn between 2 opposing camps and 2 very important priorities. The first, of course, is bringing home those hostages, returning them to their families after almost a year in captivity, whatever number of them are still alive. And on the other hand, keeping Israel secure, denying Hamas the capacity, the ability to carry out a massacre like October the 7th ever again, as it has promised to do. And so it seems as though those 2 camps are in opposition to one another, because in either way, they're prioritizing one of those priorities over another. To the families of the hostages and their supporters, they say there's absolutely nothing we can do that is more important than bringing down those hostages, bringing them home. We saw just this past weekend the horrific consequences of keeping those hostages in captivity even a moment longer. We should do whatever we can to bring them home. On the other hand, there are quite a few Israelis who say it's an unacceptable risk to, on the one hand, release thousands upon thousands of convicted terrorists who would, of course, return to the cycle of terror, as we know they have done in the past, or perhaps enabling Hamas to smuggle in arms and other such things as they did before October 7th. So this is an extremely difficult challenge in Israeli society today.
Sir, you compared these protests, or you mentioned the protests before over the judicial review. Obviously, it's a very different situation now. We can see the rage and really the pain on the faces, not just of the families of the hostages, but so many people in Israel and so many people that are protesting now. The only time hostages have been really, or the majority of the hostages have been rescued out of Gaza has been due to a hostage and prisoner swap with Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. Ultimately, time is running out, isn't it? There's about 100 hostages left. Most people accept not all of them will be alive. Do you think that that puts extra pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu that simply wasn't there before?
I think it certainly does. You know, we have had several daring rescues in which a handful of hostages have been brought home. But what we understand happened this past weekend is that as Hamas understood that Israeli forces were nearing the location in which those 6 hostages are being held, they simply shot them in the head in order to prevent Israel from taking them alive. And so, yes, the urgency is very, very real. We know that, for example, many of the hostages had pre-existing medical conditions. Some were wounded during their captivity on October 7th. They've been held under deplorable conditions. And of course, their families are desperate to bring them home under whatever circumstances, and in hopes of bringing as many of them home alive as we possibly can.
I mean, you mentioned the country is split. The truth is the cabinet is, if not split, at least divided. We know that the defense minister thinks something else. We've heard from leading Israeli politicians who also disagree with Benjamin Netanyahu and think that there should be a hostage deal, however unpalatable that may be. Why do you personally think that he's digging in his heels? Do you think that some people are saying that it's because he wants to actually continue occupying Gaza and he doesn't want a deal? Or do you think it's his political survival? What are your thoughts?
I don't think any rational Israeli wants to control Gaza. We've been there. We have no desire to continue being present in that part of the world. But we do understand that there are very real security concerns to handing over security of that entire area back to whatever entity is going to reemerge there, which may very well be Hamas. That one corridor, the Philadelphia corridor, which is essentially the border between Gaza and Egypt, has been used for smuggling for many, many years. And we understand that it was that smuggling that enabled Hamas to carry out the October 7th massacre, as it has promised it would continue to do if given the opportunity. And so when he says we need to maintain a presence there, it's not coming from nowhere. Now, it is certainly true that he is experiencing pressure from within the cabinet, particularly from certain right-wing members of his government who say they will bring down the government. They will essentially bring down his premiership if he advances with a deal that doesn't meet the basic security requirements that they have set. But of course, he is, as you know, coming under intense pressure from within Israeli society to do whatever is possible, bring those hostages home and deal with whatever broader security concerns at some later date.
No government or no country ever wants to change government in the middle of a war. But do you think that considering the splits we're seeing within the cabinet, the pressure that he's under himself and the very far right members of his cabinet that have made no secret that if he doesn't, go along with what they want him to do regarding any kind of deal, they would make the government fall? I mean, do you think that ultimately in the future we could see Israel change government in the middle of a war?
Look, it's extraordinarily difficult to bring down an Israeli government. It would essentially require certain members of the government to bolt in order to bring it down, to deny the capacity of that government to have a majority in the Knesset, in Israel's parliament. At the moment, it doesn't appear as though any of the coalition members have that interest. They realize, many of them, that they will either not be in the governing coalition or perhaps may not be in parliament at all after an election based on the current public opinion polls. But should push come to shove, and should certain members of the coalition feel either that he is not advancing a ceasefire deal in a way that they consider to be sufficient, or on the other side, that he's advancing a deal that they feel does not meet Israel's basic security requirements, there may indeed be a situation in which certain members of the government do indeed leave, and that could leave him in a very precarious situation indeed.
Very briefly, if I could just ask you, I mean, do you think he's right to be digging in his heels?
Look, I understand where he's coming from. I don't think his concerns are entirely off base. There are very real security concerns about what will happen with those terrorists who are released and perhaps will return to the cycle of violence. We know, for example, that Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, was himself released in a previous deal. And that is evidence to many opponents of the deal as it's currently conceived of what could happen if they are released. We know, again, that territory, the Philadelphia corridor, has been used for smuggling that enabled October 7th to happen. But at the end of the day, these are real people who are, we hope, many of them, some number of them, still alive. Anything that can be done to bring them home, I think, ought to be the number one priority. And I think many Israelis feel the same way at the time as well.
How damaging do you think it would be to the Israeli psyche if ultimately we don't see any more hostages come out alive from Gaza?
I think it'd be quite devastating indeed. I think that Israel has been in a reckoning since October the 7th. We wonder what went so wrong that we were caught completely unawares. But the fact that we have had hostages languishing in captivity for almost a year now feels like a breach in the basic contract between the government and citizenry, that we will do whatever is necessary to bring you home no matter what. That has been our doctrine for as long as Israel's been in existence. We've seen Israeli forces fly to the other side of the world in order to bring hostages home from similar situations. This, of course, is much more complex, but to many Israelis, that needs to be the number one priority. And I think if we don't see those hostages brought home, something very fundamental in Israel's psyche will indeed be fractured, and I don't know how we'll recover that in the future.
Avi Meir, former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. Sir, thank you so much for sharing your views with us. Thank you.
Thank you.